Letter 31. Dearest Father, I have only terminated my last letter to take up my pen for the beginning of another, for I find relief only in writing to you from the deep affliction which has struck me to the earth. If anything can add to my mortification at the death of the Nazarene Jesus, it is that I shall have endeavored so earnestly to make you believe in him also. Oh, I shall never have confidence in a human being again, and the more lovely, the more holy, the more heavenly the character of anyone, the wiser and purer their teachings, the more distrustful shall I be of them. But I will turn from these painful thoughts, and as I promised in my last, will give you an account of what passed at his trial. It is now the morning following the crucifixion, and I am calmer than I was yesterday, and will be able to write with more coherency. 24 hours have passed since he was nailed to the cross. His followers have been, since his arrest, hunted like wild beasts of the wilderness. Annas has hired and filled with wine fierce Roman soldiers and sent them everywhere to seize the fugitive Nazarenes. John was especially sought out, and the emissaries of Annas came at midnight last night to the house to take him, but we assisted him in making his escape by means of the subterranean passage that leads from the dwelling of Rabbi Amos to the catacombs beneath the temple. Emilius, though only recently a convert from the paganism of Rome, is firm in his faith that Jesus will rise again to life, and instead of giving up all as we do, he says that he should not be amazed to be suddenly told by the soldiers whom he left to guard his tomb that he had burst forth alive from the dead. But I have forgotten that I am to narrate to you, dear Father, the particulars of his accusation, trial, and condemnation. As I was not present in the praetorium, I am indebted for the further details which I shall give in part to John and in part to Rabbi Amos. As soon as the mob of Jews who had Jesus under arrest and which I saw pass the house reached the abode of Rabbi Annas, he asked them whom they had in custody, and when they answered that it was the great Nazarene prophet, he said with joy, "Bring him into the lower court that I may see him. By the rod of Aaron I would have him do some notable miracle for me." And thus speaking, the white-headed old man hastened down to the court, which, on reaching, he found thronged with the infuriated multitude. It was with difficulty he made a passage to where Jesus stood, both imprisoned and defended by a glittering lattice of Roman spears. After regarding him attentively, he said, with curiosity yet with sarcasm, "Art thou then the king of the Jews? Hast thou come to reign on the throne of David? Show me a sign from heaven, and I will acknowledge thee, O Nazarene." But Jesus stood calm and dignified, making no answer. Annas then angrily plucked him by the beard, and a messenger at the same moment arrived to say to him that Caiaphas, the high priest, demanded to have Jesus brought before him. Upon this he said in a loud voice, "Lead him to the palace. Caiaphas, my son-in-law, would see the man who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days." There now arose a dreadful shout from the priests and people, who, rushing upon Jesus, cried, "Crucify him!" and attempted to grasp his person as they guarded him along the streets. But in protecting him, as they had been commanded to do, the Romans wounded several of the Jews. Hereupon there was a great cry of sedition and shouts of, "Down with the Roman eagles! Down with the barbarians! Death to the Gentiles!" These cries were followed up by a fearful rush of the mass of men upon the handful of guards. They were forced back, their spears broken like straws or turned aside, and Jesus successfully wrested from their power. But in the height of the battle, Emilius appeared with a portion of the legion of which he was prefect, and instantly charging the people who fled before the breasts of his horses, rescued the prophet. "Rabbi," said Emilius to the prophet with compassionate respect, "I know thou hast power from God to disperse as chaff this rabble of friends. Speak and let them perish at thy divine command." "Nay, my son, I am come into the world for this hour," answered Jesus. "This also is a part of my mission from my Father. It becomes me to endure all things, even death." "You cannot die, my lord," said Emilius warmly. "Did I not see thee raise Lazarus from the tomb?" "To die I came into this world, but not for myself. I lay down my life, and I can take it again. These men could have no power over me except my Father did grant it to them. And what my Father willeth I will also. Seek not, my son, to deliver me." These words passed between them beneath the portico as Emilius was loosing the sharp cords from the bleeding wrists of the youthful prophet. "To Caiaphas! To Caiaphas!" now cried the multitude, who had been for a moment awed by the bold charge of the Roman horse, but now grew bolder as some men removed the dead and wounded out of sight. To the palace with the blasphemer, for he who calls himself God is by our law to be punished with death. To the high priest with him." "I can rescue you, great prophet," said Emilius resolutely. "Give me the word, and you are mounted on my horse and safe in the castle of David." "The high priest has sent for me. He must be obeyed," answered Jesus, and Emilius, surprised at his refusal to escape, reluctantly escorted him to the palace. The windows already glared with torches, and the superb hall of Aaron was alight with 100 flambeaux. Caiaphas was already upon his throne, although it was long past the hour of midnight, an unwonted time for him to sit in the council chamber. But his desire to have Jesus brought before him led him to hold an extraordinary court. A score of the elders and chief priests were standing about him, their dark, eager faces earnestly watching the entrance to get a look at the approaching prophet. As Jesus serenely entered, led by the sorrowful Emilius, Caiaphas bent his tall, gaunt form forward, thrust his neck and huge head in advance, and with keen eyes and sharp, scrutinizing glances, surveyed him whom he jealously looked upon as his foe. The multitude pressing in soon filled the vast hall, and even crowded upon the rostrum, upon which were seated the scribes, elders, and many of the principal priests. The Roman soldiers with clanging steel marched in and arrayed themselves on either side of the high priest's throne, leaving Jesus standing alone before its footstool. Contrasting with the brilliancy of the gorgeous hall and the glittering robes of the priests, surged and heaved and moved below the dark masses of the people in their gray and brown caps and cloaks, for the night was cold and they wore their winter garments. And all this wild ocean of human forms gleamed with 10,000 eyes, flashing like the phosphorescent stars that glitter on the surface of the upheaving sea when the shadow of the storm cloud hangs above it and the winds are about to be unbound to lash it into fury. So seemed this terrible sea of human heads, Jesus the center of their looks and of their hate. He alone of all that countless host, he alone was calm, serene, fearless. Caiaphas now waved his hand with a gesture for silence and addressed Jesus. "So then," he spoke with haughty irony, "thou art Jesus, the far-famed Galilean prophet. Men say thou canst raise the dead. We would fain behold a miracle. Thinkest thou, if we put thee to death presently, thou canst raise thyself?" "Jesus," saith Rabbi Amos, who stood near him and saw all. Jesus remained unmoved. His bearing was marked by a certain divine dignity, while an expression of holy resignation sat upon his features. He looked like peace incarnate in the form of man. A soft influence seemed to flow from his presence, producing a universal but momentary emotion of sympathy. Caiaphas perceived it and cried in his harsh, stern voice, "You have brought this man before me, men of Jerusalem. Of what do you accuse him? Let those who have accusations come forward and make them. He is a Jew and shall have justice by our laws." "Ye Jews have no power to try a man for his life, most noble Caiaphas," said Emilius. "The lives of all your nation are in the hand of Caesar and of his tribunals. You can put no man to death." Emilius had spoken in hopes that if Jesus could be brought before Pilate, the procurator, he might be by him released, for he knew Pilate had no envy or feeling against the prophet. "Thou sayest well, noble Roman," answered Caiaphas. "But for the crime of blasphemy against the temple, we are permitted by Caesar to judge our people by the laws of Moses. And this man, if rumor comes nigh the truth, has been guilty of blasphemy. But we will hear the witnesses." Hereupon several of the chief priests and scribes who had been going in and out among the crowd brought forward certain men whose very aspect showed them to be of the baser sort. One of these men testified that he had heard Jesus say that he would destroy the temple and could again in 3 days rebuild it more magnificently than it was in the days of Solomon the Mighty. Upon this testimony all the priests shouted, "Blasphemer!" and called for Jesus to be stoned to death. A second witness was now produced by Abijah, the most passionate of the scribes, who testified that Jesus had taught in Samaria that men would soon no longer worship in the temple, but that the whole earth would be a temple for Jews and Gentiles. This was no sooner heard than some of the men gnashed at Jesus with their teeth, and but for the gestures and loud voice of the high priest, they would have made an attempt to get him into their power. A third witness, a man who had been notorious for his crimes, now came up. He carried on his wrist a cock with steel gaffs upon the spurs, as if he had just been brought up from the cockpit to bear testimony, for such were the sort of fellows suborned by the priests. He testified that Jesus said that the day would soon come when not one stone should be left upon another of the temple, that he had called it a den of thieves, the priests blind guides and deceivers, the scribes foxes, and the Pharisees hypocrites. But the fourth and fifth witnesses contradicted each other, as also did others. Such opposite testimony perplexed and irritated Caiaphas and confounded the chief priests and scribes. The high priest now began to perceive that Jesus would have to be released for want of testimony against him. "What? Galilean and blasphemer of God and his temple, answerest thou nothing?" cried the high priest. "Hearest thou not what these witness against thee?" But Jesus remained silent. Caiaphas was about to break the silence by some fierce words when a voice was overheard the other side of the columns, on the left of the throne, where was a fireplace in which was burning a large fire, about which stood many persons. Rabbi Amos at once recognized in the violent speaker Peter, who had come in with him and John, the latter of whom, in the disguise of a priest, stood not far from Jesus, gazing tenderly upon him and listening with the most painful interest to all that they testified against him. But Peter stood farther off by the fire, yet not less eagerly attending to all that passed. "Thou art one of the Nazarene's followers," cried the voice of a maid who brought wood to feed the fire. "Thou needest not to deny it. I am of Galilee, and knew thee when thou wert a fisherman. Seize him, for he is one of them." "Woman, I swear by the altar and ark of God and by the sacred tables, I know not the fellow. I never saw Galilee." "Thy speech betrayeth thee now thou hast spoken," cried the woman. "Thou art a Galilean, and thy name is Simon Bar-Jonah. I know thee well, and how 3 years ago you and your brother Andrew left your nets to follow this Nazarene. May the thunders of Horeb and the curse of Jehovah follow me, if what thou sayest be true, woman. Thou mistakest me for some other man. I swear to you by the head of my father, men and brethren, that I never saw his face before. I know not the man." As he spoke, said John, he cast his angry looks toward the place where Jesus stood. He caught his master's eyes bent upon him with a tender and reproving gaze, so full of sorrowing compassion, mingled with forgiveness, that I saw Peter start as if smitten with lightning. He then pressed his 2 hands to his face, and uttering a cry of anguish and despair that made the high priest look, and which went to every heart, he rushed out by the open door into the darkness and disappeared. As he did so, the cock, which was held tied upon the wrist of the third witness, crowed twice in a loud tone. I then remembered the words of Jesus to Peter, spoken but 12 hours before. "This night, even before the cock crow the first watch of the morning, thou shalt thrice deny that thou knowest me." Upon this, added John, my confidence in my master came back full and strong, and I felt that he would not, could not be harmed, for he foreknew all things that could happen to him, and would yet escape death. At length, after great excitement and dissension among the elders, chief priests and scribes, Caiaphas placed Jesus before their great council at their demand. Their hall adjoined his own. Here they, as well as Caiaphas, questioned him closely and said, "Art thou the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? I adjure thee, by the living God, tell us plainly." Jesus then elevated his princely form, and bending his eyes upon the face of the high priest with a look so brightly celestial that Caiaphas involuntarily dropped his eyelids to the ground, answered and said, "Ye have said that which I am." The expression of his countenance, says John, seemed to shine as he had seen it in the mount when he was transfigured before him. "Men of Israel and Judah, ye hear his words," cried the high priest, rending down the blue lace from his ephod. "Hear ye his blasphemy? What think ye? Need we any further witness than his own mouth?" "He is guilty of death," cried Abner in a hoarse voice, his eyes, red with being up all the night, glaring like a leopard's, and advancing to where Jesus stood bound and bleeding, he spat in his face thrice. This was followed by a loud outcry for his death, and several vile fellows also spat upon him and pulled him by the beard. "Is this Jewish justice?" cried Emilius indignantly to Caiaphas. "Do you condemn and kill a man without witness? Stand back, for Romans are not used to seeing men condemned without law. Back, fellows, or your blood will flow sooner than his for which you thirst." At this determined attitude, they gave back for a moment and left Jesus standing in the midst, sad but serene. John ran to him and wiped the blood and uncleanness from his lips and cheeks and beard, and gave him water, which the woman who had recognized Peter compassionately brought in a ewer. "Master, use thy power and escape from them," whispered John. "Nay, tempt me not, beloved," he answered. "My power is not for my deliverance, but for that of the world. For you I can do mighty works, but for myself I do nothing. I came not to save my life, but to lay it down. Mine hour is at hand." "Let not a handful of Romans frighten you, men of Jerusalem," cried Abner. "There is not a legion in all the city. Here we are, masters, if we will it. To the rescue! Let me hear the Lion of Judah roar in his might, and the eagle of Rome will shriek and fly away. To the rescue!" "Hold, men and brethren!" cried Caiaphas, who had judgment enough to see that the first blow would be the beginning of a revolution that would bring down upon the city the Roman army quartered in Syria and end in the destruction of the nation. "Hold, madmen!" But his voice was drowned amid the roar of the human tempest. Emilius and his men were borne away on the crest of the surge and so pressed by the bodies of the Jews that they could not make use of their weapons. In the wild confusion, Jesus was carried by fierce hands to the opposite end of the council chamber, while Caiaphas strove to appease the wrath of Emilius, who insisted that the fate of Jesus should be left with Pilate the procurator. When Emilius, aided by the authority of Caiaphas, at length came where Jesus had been dragged, they found him standing blindfolded among a crowd of the basest fellows of Jerusalem, who were diverting themselves by slapping his cheeks and asking him to tell, by his divine knowledge of all things, who did it. They would also hold money before his blinded eyes and ask him to name its value or inscription, and when he still kept silence, they struck him. "We will let thee go, Nazarene," said one, "if thou wilt tell how many hairs I have in my beard." "Nay, let him divine," cried another, "what I gave for my Passover lamb in the market, and the name of the Samaritan of whom I bought it." "Out with your lambs, Kish!" shouted a third fellow, thrusting himself forward. "Let me hear him prophesy. What, Galilean, silent and sullen? I will make thee speak." And he let a blow of his staff fall upon the head of Jesus, which would have struck him to the earth but for the voice of Caiaphas, which had arrested in part its force. "Men of Israel," he cried aloud, "that this pestilent Nazarene is a blasphemer we have heard with our ears, and by our law he ought to die, because he hath made himself the Son of God. But Caesar hath taken the power of life and death out of our hands. We Jews can put no man to death, but the Romans only. That he hath spoken against Caesar and is a seditionist can be proved. Let us take him before Pilate with this accusation." The speech pleased the people, and having rebound Jesus more securely, they cried all with one voice, "To Pilate, to the praetorium!" The multitude then poured out of the gates of the palace, like a foaming and chafing river which hath overflowed its banks, and with terrible cries, which we heard even in our house, took the direction towards the praetorium. It was with difficulty that Emilius could protect the prophet in safety up the hill and to the entrance of the praetorium, which he entered with his prisoner just as the sun gilded the loftiest pinnacles of the temple. In another letter, dear Father, I will continue the account of his trial, the remembrance of which, while I now write of it, almost rekindles again all my love, faith, devotion, and confidence in him. For who but a man God sustained could have borne so meekly all this pain, insult, ignominy, and shame? Adina.